Thank you. So, how would you like your content served? Unfortunately, I don't have my speaker notes down here, so I'll just go stand over here so I can see what I have to say. What is this talk going to be about? I'm going to take about 10 minutes to introduce you to Neos, the content management system that we work with at my company and that I'm here for. It's an open source CMS, and these 10 minutes will be just to sort of set the frame around the showcases that I'll show you later. And these showcases will demonstrate a few different ways in which content can be delivered, quite interesting ways, interesting platforms, channels that can be targeted. And basically, I have two goals for this talk. My first goal is, of course, to show you interesting content, interesting showcases. And the second goal is to get maybe one person in this room so hyped that they want to try out Neos afterwards. If that one person can just stand up, then I'll be happy to talk to you later. All right. A little bit about myself. I work as a software developer, full-stack developer, backend and frontend at Sandstorm, where we create web applications. I'm a Neos core team member since last year, since 2017. And in the core team, I mostly take care of marketing stuff like standing up here and talking to people or writing articles for various magazines. And in a previous life, I used to be an SAP ERP consultant, which also is software development, but works entirely differently from the way the web works. Neos, right. Who in this room has heard about it? We have a few guys in the front. Thanks for joining me from the Neos community Vienna. That means there are quite a few people here who haven't heard about Neos, which is awesome. That means I have a chance to get some people into it. It's an open source GPL licensed content management system. So you can try it out if you want without having to pay any money, which is awesome. It used to be known as Typo3 Neos. It comes from the Typo3 Association. It was originally planned to be the successor to the Typo3 CMS, but that also got developed. So in 2015, the Typo3 Association was like, now we have two CMSs. Which one are we going to recommend to our customers? And that led to Neos becoming its own open source system with its own community, and it's doing quite well as such. So, oh, and by the way, we have no association with the political party Neos, which is known in Austria. There was already a little bit of confusion when I said I'm going to talk about Neos, and people said, oh, wow, yeah, cool, I know people at Neos. And I think, no, I don't think you do. All they do is steal away our Google search results, right? Okay, if Neos were food, right? This presentation is food themed, so if you're hungry now, you're going to hate me because you're going to be even hungrier afterwards. If Neos were a food item, we might be one of those. If any one of you has ever had crab, then you might know that if you don't know what you're doing, the results on your plate and or on your server can be a bit, interesting. And you might have to rely on the help of your friends to get it running, or to eat a little bit, at least, of crab meat. But once you make it through, once you've mastered it, you're rewarded with one of the tastiest experiences there are in the world of food or in the world of content management. And not everyone likes crab, not everyone likes fish, and we're quite happy with that. We prefer to make a certain group of people very happy instead of, almost everyone kind of a little bit happy. What makes Neos special? What makes us special? 3 things, which I'd like to mention to you. If you don't remember anything afterwards, remember these 3 things. The first thing is editor happiness. Neos was conceived originally to have really advanced front-end editing capabilities. What you see is what you get. Editing is, the term is a little bit overused, but that's essentially what it was planned to be. And it has become that. So we strive to make the people who work with the actual CMS very happy. And how we do that, let me just show you a little movie of me editing content on a Neos website. You log in, you see the website just like it is in the front end. You can remove the parts of the UI you don't need. and you can just edit content on your website. That's quite a cool thing, and that usually impresses clients quite a bit when they see it for the first time. You can publish that content to your live website, and it'll be there just like that. So it's very easy to learn for editors, editor happiness. Developer happiness is the second point that Neos CMS is about. How do we make developers happy? We have a very clean architecture. We rely on Flow, which is a PHP framework quite similar to Laravel or Symfony, only that back when Neos was conceived, there was no Laravel or Symfony to be used as a basis, which is why we have Flow. And Flow is a worthy application, a PHP application framework in its own right that Neos is built upon. It relies on best practices like Composer, Doctrine, the Symfony console, and it implements many of the PSRs. So we're quite happy with that. At the same time, we have quite sophisticated and more technically interesting things like the Neos Fusion rendering language. It's the rendering engine which takes care of all rendering in Neos. And that's, I'm not going to explain that to you because that alone would take 45 minutes. But that's very interesting, and once you get the hang of it, it's a cool thing to build a website on. And also, the Neos community prides itself to be very innovative. We like to try out new technologies. We just finished the full React rewrite of that editing UI you just saw earlier. It was based on Ember 1, now it's based on React. And the next technically interesting thing is a rewrite of the Neos content repository, which I'll be talking about in a minute, with CQRS and event sourcing. So if you like to try out advanced stuff as a developer, Neos might be the right thing for you. Okay, we've made developers happy, we've made editors happy, and we also make someone happy who usually is overlooked quite a lot, who no one really cares about, but who should be the most important player in content management, the content itself, right? These little strings of texts and images and all these kinds of things also deserve some happiness. Now, what makes content happy? Content is in Neos stored in the content repository. It's modeled as one big tree. The things in this tree are called nodes, and all content in Neos is in one tree. There's no separate tree for pages and for content elements. It's one big tree. From a modeling side of things, each node in that tree has its own identifier, and these nodes have types, such as text, or a headline, or even an address. And these types you can define yourself. That means that you can model your content in a very semantic and domain-specific way, and content likes that. Content doesn't like being forced into forms or text boxes or generic data models. Content likes being its own true self, and that's what we allow with the Neos content repository and the definition of node types. Then we have content dimensions. Content dimensions are sort of internationalization on steroids, I would call it. Let's assume we put some content in our tree, right? We have a home as a page title, and we put a headline there and an address. And now we can add another dimension. For example, language. But it doesn't have to be language. It could be something else entirely, right? You can have another version. So far, that's not very exciting. Every proper CMS can do that. What Neos can do is you can have as many dimensions as you want. And at this point, the number of dimensions on the slides is actually less than the number of dimensions in the content, but I hope you get the point. You can have as many different versions of your content, of the same content, as you like. And that enables things like tailoring contents to the specific needs of a target group, of a market, or whatever you want to do. And that's a really cool way of modeling content in a semantic and domain-specific and reusable way. right? So that makes content really happy. And now, enough talking about Neos itself. Let's talk about delivery, not delivery of beer. Stop thinking about beer for 20 more minutes. Delivery of content. And for this, I will show you a set of showcases that the Neos community has helped me compile. Thank you, David, who is in the audience, who also provided one of the showcases. And to sort of put a frame around these showcases about the ways content can be delivered and rendered, I have made up this framework. We have the, I'll classify these ways of rendering content, these showcases, in these 4 dimensions. Where is the content rendered, rendering location? How is the content rendered, with which mechanism? Which APIs or transfer formats do we use to transmit that content to where it needs to go? And which channels are we targeting, meaning which devices, which endpoints, which applications? All right, let's start with something easy, full stack. What does it mean to have a full stack CMS? Well, it means that storage and editing, content creation, and delivery happen in the same application on the same server. Right, so we have our backend at the bottom, we have the juicy Neos Fusion rendering layer there in the middle, and we have the front end on top. That's quite easy. That's what most of the content management systems do. One example for this would be that Apple website I showed you earlier, not associated with Apple Inc. And when we try to classify that, it would be, we'd have a server-side rendering. We'd have Neos Fusion as a rendering mechanism, right? Fusion takes care of compiling all the parts that and rendering the content in the places it should go. We have HTML as a transmit format, and we target browsers and websites. A different way of looking at this content would be, for example, with a custom format, right? That could be something like this. This is an XML sitemap. It's the same content. Well, not the very same as earlier, but it's the same content that gets delivered to your website viewers and their browsers, just rendered for search engines. Another example of this could be an RSS feed, right? So it's still text-based. It still can be rendered with Neos Fusion, and it's really the same mechanism, only we target different devices, right? Okay, I think you grasped it. Let's talk about headless showcase with Neos. MediaLib is an example of a headless application. It's made by Dominic Fire from the Neos community. And what they do is they provide a platform for video content. Some of their it's highly adaptable, so customers can basically rent or can get an account, and what they get is a custom Neos backend and a custom-made front end. And the front ends. No, let me start the other way around. The backend is always the same. It's always Neos, just different instances, of course. The front end can be quite different. So one customer might use MediaLib to stream children's movies. Another customer might use it to stream educational videos. And this content can come from a variety of sources. Here you can see the editing backend of MediaLib. And as you can see, it's not real website output. It's just metadata content for these movies that are delivered via MediaLib, but with no intention of ever rendering this, right? If you would look at this, the Neos frontend, it would look exactly the same. It's not the frontend I showed you earlier. The content is actually sourced from external asset sources. In this case, it's TMDB, and Neos can just connect to these external asset providers and sort of proxy the content through to where it needs to go, right? The way the front end, which is written in Elm, by the way, connects to that backend is via GraphQL. Anyone in the room who doesn't know how GraphQL works? Cool. Then I can almost skip this explanation and just say we have, for example, a query that gets the active channel and channel overviews from the backend, and one requests title, ID, the currently highlighted movie, and so on. And the response looks like this. It's still content from the same content repository from that big tree I showed you earlier, but it's rendered in an entirely different way via a custom API, right? So that is a very nice example of a headless website. Rendering happens fully client-side. As I said, the clients are written in Elm, and Dominic said, when I asked him why did you pick Elm, it allows you to really be able to test that every iteration of the backend you made is still compatible with the front end, right? So Elm, he says, is a very good choice for that. It could also be React or whatever you like. And we have a GraphQL API based on the Neos GraphQL package, which we provide, which is not in the Neos core yet, but which is available as a community plugin. And we're still targeting browsers and websites. Another model to deliver content could be the hybrid full stack. What does that mean? Here's an example. This is a learning application which I'm currently building for a customer, so it's still under development. It doesn't look very attractive. But the way it works is we have actually two ways of rendering content on the same page, right? We have a React application that is delivered from Neos, but is developed independently of Neos, right? That does the most part of the rendering, and it provides the frame, right? It takes care of front-end login and communicates with the Neos backend via an API and gets its initial data, the initial data that it displays, like, for example, the selection of the learning content, the list of learning content, gets delivered as JSON payload with the initial request, with the same request that the React app is also delivered. And then when the user actually starts looking at learning content, he will have this window in the middle. The React application has this window in the middle, which uses, again, the normal rendering mechanisms of Neos via an iframe, right? So we have pre-rendered content in the middle and client-side rendered content outside, which would be a hybrid full-stack approach. We have rendering on the server side and the client side. We have Neos Fusion and React as rendering mechanisms. And we have HTML and JSON, but still the same content. And again, we target browsers and websites. If we take this further, and now we come to the showcases, which are technically a bit more interesting, a bit more challenging, we have a two-stack approach. What does that mean? It means that instead of having one application that delivers content as well as stores it and gives you the editing backend, we have two applications. One takes care of content creation and storage, and one takes care of content delivery. Of course, that's more complicated, but the advantage is you can optimize these two applications independently from each other, right? You can optimize the delivery layer for speed, for performance, and you can optimize the creation layer for other things, for user experience, for example. One example that uses this two-stack approach is the one-on-one seller or one-on-one reseller portals. They are a series of websites through which individuals or companies can resell products of the German hosting company one-on-one, for example, DSL contracts and hosting products. And the way in which these websites are built, in which they are laid out, is like this. We have static content, the gray stuff, right? That would be content that users input in Neos, just like I edited the Apple text earlier, and that gets delivered from Neos. Then we have Angular components, which can also be put in there by the content creators, right? But only, of course, in the backend, they don't really do anything, but they add interactivity to the front end. And finally, we have placeholders. placeholders for data that the content management system doesn't know about and shouldn't know about. For example, prices. You don't ever want to store prices in your content management system. They belong somewhere else in the ERP, for example. So these placeholders are replaced in the delivery layer. Works like this. We have the client down here, and the client, when the client sends a request to the public-facing server, this is a Java API, right? A Java stack written in Spring Boot. And this Java stack then takes care of getting the content from the actual content repository, which is Neos, from the content creation layer, from the backend, you could call it, and takes care of placeholder replacement by replacing these placeholders with stuff that comes from APIs to ERPs. And it also takes care of caching. In this case, Redis was used to achieve in-memory caching. Okay? And then we can deliver that, the content can then be delivered from that Java application to the clients. When we try to classify that, it gets a bit more complicated. We have to put a bit more stuff on these slides. We have the content store, where content is edited and rendered. We have the delivery layer, and we have client-side rendering as well, because we have Angular components. Content store is Neos Fusion, the delivery layer is Java, and the client side is Angular. And we have HTML and JSON as a transfer format, again, together with custom REST APIs between the delivery layer and the backend, the storage layer. And we target, again, browsers and websites. And because this is quite boring, if we only target browsers and websites, we'll talk about multi-channel for two more examples, which are also very interesting. Multi-channel means that you don't target only one device, but multiple, quite different channels. One example, I came across this on the Vienna Underground yesterday, and the content for these public signage screens has to come from somewhere. And of course, what you don't want is to have to maintain that content in one place and the content for your website, for example, which could have the same stuff on it, in another place. So one example how this works, we have a middleware. In this case, it's Screeners. Again, thanks, David, for the examples. And that pulls data from all kinds of sources. For example, from the Neos website. It's the content that also gets output for visitors of a website. And this gets pushed to a third-party service. In this case, one example would be Screeners, and then displayed on these public screens. I think Screeners can do even more things. You're experimenting with AI. So there's a talk worth watching from this year's Neos conference, Hello AI, I think it was called, where David talks about chatbot applications with Neos. And there's quite a lot of complex stuff that you have to think about when you want to model content, not only for regular content visitors, but also in a way that the machine, the chatbot framework, can understand it. That makes for quite a challenge in these projects. When we classify that, we have the server-side and the third-party middleware where rendering happens, and we communicate with browsers and these digital signage things via HTML and custom APIs. Another very, very interesting, and also my last showcase, my last example, is something that was provided to me by Daniel Lienert and Punkt.de from the Neos community. They had the task of, well, they had a client, a publishing house, that decided to go really all in with the digital transformation, which is a cool thing to do, right? They decided, okay, we want to have our content in one central content store, and we want to not only deliver it to classical digital ways like classical digital ways like websites or email newsletters, but also the same content should go into books and magazines. How do you achieve that? Well, what they did was put Neos in the middle And that means that delivering content to a website is quite easy because Neos is made for that. But how do you target, how do you get something to print from a web-based CMS? How do you get a format that you can print? You don't do it with CSS print styles. What you do instead, or what they did, they had to take, or they had to come up with a format that the printer could understand. And that format, the industry standard for that format, is Adobe InDesign. Okay, cool. How do we get content to Adobe InDesign from a web-based content management system? Still not very easy. InDesign has a scripting API that you can control from another application. But we're still on the server. So how do we get our content from there? How do we control InDesign's scripting API from the server? Well, we don't. What they did was they built a little Electron app. And with this Electron app, they were able to control the scripting API and pull the content from the storage layer from Neos into this print template. And because that's all a bit abstract, let's have a look at a short video. This shows the website content in an intermediary format called DTA. It's an XML standard for which they have built a little bit of colorful rendering. And when we look at the website, the resulting website, it looks like this, right? Easy. And then they start the Electron app, input the URL as a unique identifier, and say, OK, start the scripting. And then this Electron app will control the scripting layer, pull the content from the content repository, and create that article, that InDesign article. And that's really quite amazing. And in the end, we have that printed magazine. So that was their way of getting content from that digital content repository, which is somewhere in the web, to a print-ready format that could be delivered to a printer. Really neat. We have server-side rendering, and we have third-party software. And the mechanisms are, again, Neos Fusion and Adobe InDesign via this Electron app. And we deliver that content as well in HTML and CSS, as well as in this DTA format, paired with some custom APIs. And we target now browsers and print products with the same content. Cool stuff. This already concludes the showcases I wanted to show you. And I'd like to give a little outlook about what happens with Neos, what could happen with Neos. It's an open source project, so we don't really know on this until we've built it. I said earlier, we're sort of this crab. It's quite opinionated on what it can do, and what it can do, it does very well. What we might become in the near future is something like this. We still want to have a very good user experience. We still want to focus on the editing experience. But what we also want to have is a universal way of accessing content. This sort of exists currently. But the vision is to have one API that is accessed by that editing backend I showed you earlier, but can also be consumed by basically arbitrary front ends, so that there's a universal way of accessing content. And that the likely technical solution for this is GraphQL for obvious reasons. It seems like the best candidate at the moment. It's not really decided that we're going to use it yet. But we're quite happy with the ways, or with the things it can do. Cool. This concludes my list of showcases. I hope it was interesting for you. If you'd like to get in touch, go to Neos.io. I'd love to see some of you try it out. And if you'd like to get in touch with me, feel free to ping me on Twitter or wherever. So if you're hungry now, then there's a break. You can grab a bite to eat. Thank you.